Welcome to the RLH Project's podcast, Love Matters, where we talk about real academic research mixed with real-life experiences to hopefully improve the real relationships you have with important people in your life. I'm the founder of the RLH Project and the host of the Love Matters podcast, Dr. Jennie Rosier. I'm also an associate professor of communication studies at James Madison University, a wife to my favorite person on the planet, a mother of 4 young children, and an all-around love enthusiast. As an expert in romantic and parent-child relationships, I've dedicated my life to figuring out how individuals can use communication to live happy, healthy lives connected to other people. I hope that this podcast can help you. Hello, friends. This is the first episode of the first season of the RLH Project's podcast, Love Matters. For season 1, I've decided to do an in-depth 12-episode explanation of a single concept that impacts us all, attachment. I actually teach a class at James Madison University in the School of Communication Studies called Attachment Communication, and much of this season's podcast is based on my lectures from that class. Whether you don't know anything about attachment or you feel like you're an expert on the topic, I hope that listening to this season of the Love Matters podcast will spark a new interest in you to think about how your own early life experiences have molded you into who you are today, how your interactions with others impact them and you in both positive and negative ways, and how your relationships with the people you love are shaped by attachment. Lucky for you, I'm not just offering a podcast to help you understand attachment. I've also created a 60-page digital workbook that you can purchase through the link in my Instagram bio at Relationships Love Happiness or on my website, www.relationshipslovehappiness.com. This digital workbook not only complements the podcast, but it also includes extra attachment tips and information that's not covered in the podcast. And it includes self-reflection prompts throughout it that will encourage you to dig deep and reflect on your own past and current life experiences. Before you start listening to this episode, get yourself a copy of the Attachment Matters digital workbook. You won't regret it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. No matter what time it is, no matter where you are, I am so thankful that you are spending your time with me. I'm going to start episode 1 the way that I start most of my classes at JMU, with a story. Like I said in the intro, I have 4 children. The youngest is 5 years old, and before the pandemic, he went to a preschool 4 days a week. Basically, while I was teaching at JMU, he went to this preschool and then I would pick him up. So he went around 8 a.m. until 1, maybe 2 p.m. And then I would pick up his older siblings from school and we would all head home. So our youngest son, Rex, went to this preschool, and let me preface this story by saying that we absolutely loved his preschool. We never had any issues with it, and it was a loving, warm environment with teachers who had been there for years. There was a focus on play and creativity more than academics, which is what we were looking for in a preschool, and it was just a really nice family environment. There was one of his little friends there, and I'm going to change her name so that, we can keep people a little anonymous, but there was one little friend there. Her name was Susie. And Susie was what I think a lot of adults would call a handful. She was very emotional. She would have what many adults would call a tantrum or pitching a fit frequently about seemingly insignificant small things. So she would not be able to get her shoes on and she would cry uncontrollably. She would want to go home in the middle of the day and she would cry uncontrollably. She would not get to do whatever activity she wanted to do, and she would cry uncontrollably. Susie would cry a lot, and I think that she got a bit of a reputation at the school by the adults as being difficult. So I would come and drop Rex off in the morning around 8. And many times Susie would be upset about something. It also seemed like Susie had been there a while already. So she was usually one of the first kids to be dropped off. So she would be there sometime. They opened at 6:30 in the morning. So she would be there sometime between 6:30 and 8 a.m. because I would drop Rex off at 8. So and she was always there. So she would get dropped off earlier in the morning, and many times she would be upset about something. I also know that Susie would get picked up rather late in the day. So this was a full day preschool daycare center, and she would frequently be picked up around 5 or 6. It closed at 6. And so she would often get picked up in the last hour that it was open. This means she was at school for several hours a day, 4 days, 5 days a week. So she would be at school probably more than she would be at home with her family, at least awake hours, right? So she spent a lot of time at this school, and she became quite close to many of the teachers because of that. Well, one time when I was picking Rex up at the end of the day, it was nap time, and I walked in the school and I could hear Susie crying from the front door. And she's really crying. She's crying loud, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what has happened? This has to be serious. And so I go into the classroom, and all the other children are awake, clearly, because Susie is crying really loud. All the other kids are awake, and they are, wrapping up their nap mats and reading books and playing with each other. And Susie is on her cot, sitting up on her cot, sobbing, alone. Now, I know what you might think. You're thinking, like, oh my gosh, they would leave a 4-year-old sitting on a cot by herself crying? Like, that's terrible. Let me remind you that Susie cried about everything. And so while I was pretty upset that Susie was crying by herself and I wanted to stop her from crying by herself, I also kind of understood. She cried about everything. And so I could imagine what was going on through the adults' heads, like, oh goodness, here we go. Susie crying again. She'll cry about anything, and there's no soothing her. There's no making her feel better. And so, just let her get it out. Just let her cry over there by herself. I can't deal with it, right? So I had just worked all day. I hadn't been around children all day. I could totally deal with it. I was refreshed and ready to deal with the crying fit of any kid, which is how I think a lot of parents feel when they have a break from children. Then they feel like refreshed and ready to do it again, ready to tackle the tantrums again. So I walked over to Susie and sat down in front of her and said, Susie, are you okay? What's wrong? And she goes, I want to go home. I miss my mommy. And I said, well, Susie, your mommy will be here in a couple of hours. She always comes to get you. She will be here around the same time as she was the other day, all the other days. Unfortunately, you can't go home now. But, mommy loves you, and mommy misses you just as much as you miss her. And she'll be here soon. And she looks at me and she says, do you think she misses me too? And I said, oh yeah, mommy definitely misses you too. And then I asked her, Susie, can I give you a hug? To which she nodded. So I hugged her. And she hugged me back. Like, really hugged me back. Like she hadn't been hugged in a really long time. And like she needed it. And so we hugged. We stood there and hugged each other. And she slowly calmed down. It took like a whole minute or two of hugging, but she calmed down. The next day, like the very next day, I took Rex to school, and Susie runs up to me and hugs my legs, and she just starts talking. Hi, Rex's mommy. How are you? Can I see your necklace? Can I see your earrings? Where are you going? Are you going to work? When are you going to be back? Can you play with me? Can you look at this? Look at what I drew. I mean, like, unbelievable word vomit. And I got down, at her level. And I said, Hi, Susie. How are you? I missed you since yesterday. And she said, You missed me? And I said, Oh, yeah, I totally missed you. I'm glad to see you today. I'm so happy to see you today. I'll see you when I pick up Rex, but I have to go to work now. And she said, Oh, no, please stay, please stay, please stay. I'm like, I can't stay, but I can give you a hug, and I have to go to work, and then I'll see you when I pick Rex up later. And she said, Okay, Rex's mommy, okay. We hugged each other. I hugged Rex, and I went to work. Every subsequent time that I dropped Rex off or picked Rex up, Susie would come running to me, hugging me, talking to me about what she was doing, asking me to look at things for her, and I don't know, just all kinds of things. I mean, she would just keep coming and talking to me. About a week goes by, and I come to pick up Rex, and Susie is crying. She's having an emotional breakdown of some kind, and it's unclear what it's about. This time, though, a teacher is holding her, like holding her on her hip. I look, and the teacher is holding her on her hip, but Susie is not like folded in to the teacher. If you've ever held a small child, kids either sit on your hip and just sit there like you're holding them, and they just sit there and they're not really connected to you. Like they don't embrace you while you're holding them. They kind of lean back and sit up straight, and they're not really like attached to you. But there's other times when a kid is. So you're holding a child who's upset or tired, and their body like almost melts into your body, right? They're hugging you, they're holding around your neck, or they're laying their head on your shoulder or on your chest. Susie was not doing that, and Susie was still crying. So Susie was like kind of leaned back in the teacher's arms. The teacher was not talking to her. She was just holding Susie, carrying her around. I don't know what was done with Susie before I got there, but trying to get a child to calm down, you can't just hold them and expect it to work. You have to kind of interact with them and do something. And so I walked over to the teacher and I said, Can I talk to Susie? And she's like, Sure. And she puts Susie down, and I get down at Susie's level and I said, Susie, can I give you a hug? And she nods her head, and we hug, and she calms down. Here's the thing about Susie. Susie is at school longer than she is at home. Susie, from what I know about her, has a bit of a strained relationship with her parents. I think that her father is domineering and strict and authoritative. At one point during the school year, the kids were talking about emotions, and they wrote these little things about I'm happy when, and it was, funny things like when Rex wrote, "When my dad puts me on his shoulders." And then it was like, "I'm angry when," and Rex wrote, "When my dad doesn't put me on his shoulders." Or when my dad tells me I can't get on his shoulders. That's what it was. And then it's like, "I'm sad when," and he wrote, "When my dad forgets to put me on his shoulders." So those were Rex's three emotions. When they do these little activities, they tape them to the wall, and the parents can walk up and the steps and walk down the hallway and see them on the bulletin boards and such. I remember reading Susie's though and realizing why Susie behaved the way she behaved, or at least part of it. So Susie's was, "I'm happy when my sister plays with me. I'm angry when my mommy and daddy take my toys away. I'm sad when my daddy spanks me." And when I read that, one, I thought it was really ballsy for the teacher to write down what she said and willingly post it on a board for lots of people to read. I thought, wow, that takes some guts to put that up there. But then I also just started thinking about Susie. Susie cried a lot about anything and everything. Susie wanted connection, and she wasn't getting it. She wasn't getting it from many of the teachers because they were tired of her. She was draining. And so they weren't, comforting her the way that she needed to be comforted. She likely was also not getting it at home. All little kids want is connection. They want to feel safe and they want to feel connected. They want to feel loved. They want to feel lovable. And Susie was not getting that, which is the reason why, one, when I gave it to her, she ate it up. But two, why she became very attached to me, a seemingly distant stranger, right? Like, sure, she saw me come in and drop Rex off and picks Rex up, but I didn't know her. She didn't know me. I was basically a stranger, and she was willing to attach to me very quickly after I showed her a very small amount of attention. This showed me that she did not get the attention that she needed, that she did not have the connection that she really, really desired. And this idea of connection is at the center of attachment theory. So I think that in order to really understand attachment theory, we should back up several decades to the 1940s when Dr. John Bowlby, a British psychologist, was creating the theory. John Bowlby, like I said, he was a psychologist, and he was interested in the negative outcomes that children were experiencing after being separated from their mothers during the bombings of London. And so let's talk a little bit about that. There were bombings happening in London, and parents wanted to protect their children. So they were sending them off to live with other people in the countryside. Okay, I know what you're thinking because I'm thinking it too. Parents were sending their kids away during a traumatic experience. Yes, they were. I'm not fully aware of why parents didn't go with the kids. I honestly don't know. I guess they felt like they had to stay home and protect their houses or their properties, and they just didn't want the kids to be there. Like, I don't know if this was me. We would all go to the countryside to get away from the bombings in London. But for whatever reason, lots of parents, not all parents, but lots of parents were sending their children to live in the countryside. I personally cannot imagine sending one or all of our four children to go live with family members or strangers, but, people did what they thought they had to do. And this was really common practice for people to do. Unfortunately, some of the children were actually being sent to the countryside because their parents had passed away. So they didn't have other parents and they had to get out of London because it was so dangerous. Sometimes they would send them to family members that they knew. They had a great aunt that lived in the countryside and they said, "Here, take care of my children while this is happening." Sometimes children were sent to a relative that they didn't know's house. So, still a relative, someone that was supposed to be warm and welcoming, but they didn't know them. And then other times they would be sent to a town that had people who were willing to care for children. And it was kind of an interesting, like, foster care situation. So children would come to the town center, and people who had the means to take care of those children would come to the town center and say, "I can take 3 children, I can take 2 children, I can care for 5 children." And they would care for them while this was happening. If you've ever watched the Disney movie, it's a classic. I watched it a lot when I was little. Bedknobs and Broomsticks. You would, I think it's Angela Lansbury, isn't it? You would know that that is what is happening in this movie. So in this movie, the children are brought to this town, and Angela Lansbury takes them home with her. She ends up being a witch, and lots of wonderfully innocent Disney mayhem and imagination ensues. And since the kids' parents had passed away, Angela Lansbury, the witch, ends up like formally adopting them at the end, and all is well, and they live happily ever after. Let's get back to the bombings in London. Parents were sending their children to the countryside for safety. The children were fed, they were sheltered, they were clothed, they were cared for. There were very few instances or reports of verbal or physical abuse. And so, they seemed to be like all of their needs were being met. But as a psychologist, John Bowlby still noticed a significant amount of negative outcomes in the children. So he started to ask why. Why do these children feel the way that they feel? They were taken care of. Like, why are they so upset? And by negative outcomes, I mean they ranged in severity. So some children experienced just sadness, other children experienced depression, bouts of mental illness later in their lives, feelings of detachment and distance from their parents, maybe not even welcoming seeing their parents again. And so he started to look into the separation between mother and child as being the cause of these problems. Separation anxiety is real. Children tend to not fare well when they're separated from a primary caregiver or when they're put in an unfamiliar situation. I'm sure that many of you who have children can attest to the upset that often ensues when we try to separate from our children. Whether it's dropping off your 1-year-old at a new daycare or passing your clingy 6-month-old over to great Aunt Susie, who's been begging to hold her at your cousin's wedding. We've all been there trying to calm our children crying in distress. Listen to my friend Brandy, a mom of 3 children, ages 10, 8, and 2, describe a time when one of her children was experiencing separation anxiety.
My children have all gone through separation anxiety, and I'm just remembering back to when I put my 10-year-old Carter in daycare for the first time, and I'd never experienced that before, so it was new to me, what to expect when he walked through the door of daycare and when he was dropped off every day. But the teachers were great, because they had dealt with it obviously so long. And yeah, he would cry and we didn't, understand what in the world I was doing. He would just be so upset. But the teachers there said, you know, you need to give him the power in this situation. So what he would do was he would push me out of the class. And that was just kind of his way of saying, it's okay now, mom. Like, I'm pushing you out. I'm going to have a fun day. And that pushing me out of the class really helped him. And just, getting to know the class. But yeah, he would definitely went through separation anxiety.
Clearly, this story, along with hundreds of other stories I've heard from moms and dads over the years, shows that the experience doesn't have to be as traumatic as being sent to the countryside without your parents during a war for an undetermined amount of time in order for a child to experience separation anxiety. Whenever a child is separated from a parent, there is some kind of anxiety that they're feeling inside of their body. Now, John Bowlby was an academic, and so he had many students who learned about attachment theory like along with him as he was developing it. One of those students was Mary Ainsworth, who was an American Canadian psychologist and a student of John Bowlby. And her, along with her students and John Bowlby's other students, really laid a foundation for modern attachment theory research. She has been named the mother of attachment theory, and John Bowlby has been named the father of attachment theory. Um, and many of her research studies have been identified as cornerstones of modern day attachment theory. So this is really important. Their research, along with thousands of other studies, have tested some aspect of attachment theory for the last 70 years. And it is one of the most studied theories in all of the social sciences. Uh, Interestingly, it also runs the gamut in terms of different fields. So, researchers in a wide variety of fields use attachment as part of their research studies. So, people in sociology, anthropology, child development, family studies, psychology, and communication studies, which is actually my area of expertise. Now that you have a pretty general but still good understanding of the origins of attachment theory, I think that it's important to switch gears and talk a little bit about what the attachment process actually is, how attachment is developed. Attachment is used to explain the bond between a child and their caregivers. Caregivers can be one person, like a parent or a nanny, or a few individuals, like a parent, a grandparent, and a child care provider. Anyone who spends a significant amount of time with the infant has the potential to become a secure base for that infant. So, anyone who's going to be around the infant should be willing to be consistently sensitive and able to attend to all of the infant's needs so that attachment bonds can be developed. Let me be the first to say, though, this is really hard. When you are the primary caregiver of an infant, it is very difficult to be consistently sensitive and consistently responsive and able to emotionally and physically attend to all of the infant's needs. Believe me, I have 4 children. I have been down this road. Listen to this conversation between myself and my friend Lauren. She's a mom to a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old. Here we're talking about just how difficult that beginning newborn stage is and how some people forget to tell us about it. Oh, and just as a little warning, there is a teensy bit of profanity in this conversation. So if you have young ears around, keep them covered. If you were going to describe parenthood your journey on parenthood so far. In a few words, how would you describe it?
If you would have asked me this right after I had Nora, I would have to say difficult, hard, maybe a little bit of I did something that I shouldn't have done. You know what I mean? With the 4-month-old, Sean, a totally different experience where it's rewarding. Seeing the two of them interact positively together melts my heart. So right now, it's great. After my first, it was not great.
Isn't that funny? I mean, I think that happens for everybody. And everybody, the first is always so, so hard because it's just such a jolt to your system.
That's
Um,
bullshit. Everyone told me how great it was and how much it
oh
was gonna
man,
be.
people are
And then like
assholes.
I had her and I was like, something is
No,
clearly wrong
people,
with me.
Lauren's right. It is so hard. Having a baby is great in so many wonderful ways. But unfortunately, it's also not so great in a lot of other ways. The point is, though, whoever is the primary caregiver for your infant, they need to be available and ready and willing and motivated to do the attachment work, to physically and emotionally respond in a sensitive and consistent way to your baby every time your baby's in distress. Let me try to explain this more clearly. Human beings are all born with an innate desire to form bonds with others. We are born with this desire. Based on what happens in early childhood, some of us increase the desire to form bonds with other people, some of us decrease this desire. But we're all born with the same innate desire to form bonds with others. And we do this because we want to feel secure and safe. An infant, and when I talk about infants, I'm typically just meaning birth to 12 months of age. So, an infant feels secure when their primary caregiver is nearby and sensitive to their needs. So, when John Bowlby was first talking about attachment, he talked a lot about proximity and how infants want to be physically near their primary caregivers in order to feel safe and secure. Those feelings of safety, those feelings of security are in all of us, and they are desirable feelings that we all want very badly. Even you, right now, as an adult, probably have felt from time to time that you are not safe or not secure and it doesn't feel very good. So we all want it, but babies really, really need it. And in order for babies to feel safe and secure, a primary caregiver, so a mom or a dad or grandma or daycare provider or nanny or anyone who spends a significant amount of time with the baby, needs to be nearby, so physically close, and sensitive to the baby's needs. So, those are two really strong attachment needs that infants have: proximity and sensitive responsiveness. When an infant cries, and trust me, infants cry all the time for a variety of reasons. I think there's an old school way of thinking that when an infant cries, one of their really um, tangible needs is what they're trying to get met. Like they are hungry, or they're sleepy, or they need their diaper changed. Babies cry for way more reasons than just those three. So, a baby could be crying because they are scared, they are startled by a loud noise or an unfamiliar noise. They could feel anxiety about their environment. So, if you go somewhere that they are not familiar with, They could feel anxious about just being there because they've never been there before, or new people can make them feel this way and they could cry. Babies also cry because they just are lonely and they just want to be around their caregiver. They don't want to be by themselves. They don't want to be in the bouncy seat or in their crib or laying on the floor. A very small infant really thrives when they are held, like all the time. I have 4 children myself, and I can say that I felt like some days I was holding my baby maybe for, I don't know, 8 to 9 to 10 to 12 collective hours in a day. I mean, I can't explain how much holding a newborn requires. They definitely feel much more safe and secure when they are held as much as you are physically capable of holding them. Listen to my friend Rachel. She's a mom of 3 kids, 12, 7, and 4. Here she's talking about just how shocking and surprising and unexpected the new mom phase is.
I guess initially when I was a new mom, intimidating, isolating, and I guess probably way more intense than I could have ever imagined, especially from like emotional level. It was just the overwhelming and most of it completely just the positive stuff, but some of the stuff when you're not aware of going to need you, it was just completely intimidating. I lived almost 2,000 miles away from my mother at that point. I didn't have anybody to help me the way that a mothering community would have been able to help me. So, as an older mother, it was definitely something I looked forward to. I had my second born, almost 6 years after my firstborn, and I was ready in a whole different way to be a mother. I was looking forward to the oneness of being with my baby. There was cluster feeding a couple weeks, and that wasn't fun. That was my first experience with that. But other than that, I was so excited to just be alone to be isolated with my baby and to connect with her was one of my most cherished memories.
Not everyone experiences this new first time parent jolt, but lots of people do. And it comes from a lot of different places. So sometimes this new jolt is so shocking because of your change in routine. It's such a dramatic change in routine. You have less time for yourself, you have less time for your partner, you have less time for your other family and your friends. All of your time is spent caring for, physically carrying around, feeding, changing, cleaning your newborn baby. And so it can be a really surprising, unexpected, stressful, isolating, as Rachel put it, time in your life. Sometimes the jolt comes from other places. So it's not just about the amount of time or the amount of tasks that you have, but it can be from the conflict that inevitably ensues when you have a new baby between your partner and you. That's another topic for a whole nother podcast. Regardless of when or why or how you experience this first time parent jolt, the fact is that putting in the work that you need to put in to start the attachment building process with a baby is time consuming and it requires a lot of dedication and motivation. To finish explaining the attachment process, I want to talk about 2 really important concepts. Internal working models and attachment foundations. Individuals who feel safe and secure tend to have more positive opinions of themselves, more positive opinions of others, more positive opinions of the world around them. And these opinions or these ideas of, positivity or negativity that people have are in our internal working models in our brains. So, what are internal working models? Well, they help explain the development of mental representations inside of each and every one of us. We live our lives interacting with different people, and attachment theory would argue that a lot of our internal working models about the worthiness of ourselves and expectations about other people's reactions to ourselves are based on our interactions with our primary caregivers. These interactions become internalized, and therefore it then becomes an automatic process. So we interact with our primary caregivers, we start to believe that we should be treated a certain way, that other people are a certain way, and that we are good or bad. And again, it's on a continuum, so it's not like an either or category here. It's a continuum. Sometimes people view themselves really, really negatively, other times really, really positively. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. These internal working models or mental representations that we develop then guide our future behavior as they generate expectations of how individuals will respond to us. So, for example, if a parent rejects a baby's need for care, this creates an internal working model that later manifests or could manifest into an adult believing that close relationships should be avoided in general, or that a certain amount of rejection is not only expected, but should be tolerated in a close relationship. A child whose caregiver exhibits high levels of parental sensitivity, responsiveness, and is reliable is likely to develop a positive internal working model of themselves. They will also likely develop a positive internal working model of others. So, I am good, other people are good, relationships are valuable. During the first few years of life, some researchers would argue it's the first 18 months, while others would argue it's the first 3 years of life. I tend to err on the side of the latter, so I feel like it takes a few years for this to happen. But during those first few years of life, an attachment foundation is developed. And I say foundation because it's important that I say foundation instead of attachment style. If you read attachment research, you'll see that a lot of researchers use the phrase attachment style is developed in the first few years of life. I like to say foundation. To me, a foundation implies that other experiences can be kind of built on top of that foundation, further impacting our internal working models. A style, to me, implies that it's kind of fixed and set in stone. We know that attachment is malleable. We know that it is not set in stone. And so whenever I talk about attachment, I tend to use the phrase attachment foundation. So in the first 3 years of life, an attachment foundation is developed. And this tells children how to view themselves, how to view other people, how to view relationships, how to view the world. The key here is you hope as a parent that the attachment foundation that was developed is a secure one where they view themselves positively, they view other people positively, they view relationships as worthwhile, and they view the world as a safe place to be. That is the ideal. A child takes their attachment foundation with them. And it stays with them for the rest of their lives. Like I said a minute ago, we might let other experiences, other life experiences build upon this foundation and impact our internal working models, but that foundation is always there. What happened in the first few years of life is always there. And so this is why early childhood responsiveness, sensitivity is so vital, because even if you have not so great of an early childhood and you have a wonderful rest of your life, that foundation will always be there, and it will be difficult to build. It's more difficult to build attachment security than it is to tear it down. And so that foundation is really, really important. All right, before I wrap up episode 1, I wanted to go over the attachment process one more time. So, an infant, a newborn baby, experiences some kind of distress and cries. Let's say that the caregiver quickly responds in a positive and loving way. And the caregiver does that repeatedly. Every time the baby cries, the caregiver responds very quickly and in a loving way, in a positive way. Oh, hello, baby. How are you? What do you need? I'm here for you. The baby then begins to develop an internal working model in their brain that tells them that people in general are trustworthy. You have to remember that infants do not have a lot of contact with that many people. And so their primary caregivers are the ones who are creating this internal working model. So when the baby begins to trust that the caregiver will help, and the caregiver continues to quickly and sensitively respond to a baby every single time a baby is in distress, baby then uses the trust built with his or her caregiver to develop a secure attachment foundation. This allows the baby to view others as trustworthy and the world as a positive place to be, and themselves positively. Now, let's say that a different scenario happens. A baby experiences some kind of distress and cries. Caregiver either responds too slowly, responds insensitively, or allows the baby to cry it out. The baby begins to develop an internal working model where they are unsure if the caregiver can help or if the caregiver is willing to help. This changes, it begins to change how they view themselves. So it could make them view themselves negatively or view other people more negatively. If the caregiver continues to insensitively respond to a baby, or, and this is key, or is inconsistent in their responses to a baby, where sometimes they're reacting in a positive, loving way, and other times they're reacting in a negative, nasty, not happy, non-loving, or even violent way, baby begins to develop an internal working model where they lose trust in the caregiver, and they could develop an insecure attachment foundation. This could cause the baby to either feel anxiety about or avoidance towards other people and the world. It could also cause them to view themselves negatively. The way that manifests is if a baby starts to develop this internal working model where they think that their caregiver is not going to come for them when they need them, they start to question their own value, question their own worth. Are they worthy of someone who is trustworthy? Are they worthy of someone who is willing to come to them and love them and take care of them? And so it can impact their own self-concept. Thank you all so much for joining me for episode 1 of season 1 of the Love Matters podcast. If you're following along in the Attachment Matters digital workbook, this episode went over information from chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed the attachment process graphics included in that chapter, and I also hope you personally got something out of completing the self-reflection prompts. I'd like to give a special thanks to my mom contributors in this episode, Brandy, Rachel, and Lauren. Again, I'm your host, Dr. Jennie Rosier, and as always, you can find me on Instagram at Relationships, Love, Happiness, on Facebook and YouTube by searching for the Relationships, Love, Happiness Project, and on the web at www.relationshipslovehappiness.com. I hope you'll join me for episode 2, where I plan to talk about outcomes of attachment. Thanks for listening.